Do you believe in the men in black? Because surviving an encounter with something unexplained isn't enough. You have to be carefully monitored afterward by abnormal, suited men, in case you talk too much. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you should be listening to this podcast on Spotify or Apple if you aren't already. Today's episode features stories that take place in deserts, dry, hot, and apparently full of terror. If you have a story of your own, share it with me at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. The Tall, Thin Man, from Mr. Lee. I'll start by saying I've done work for the government that leaves very little here I can actually share in detail. However, this feels like a good way to get some things off my chest. When I was 23 years old, I joined the Naval Reserve, pretty much on a whim. After finding that I kind of liked the life, the sign-on bonus wasn't half bad either. I decided going full-time was the right move for me. Now, anyone who knows the military knows that basic training isn't all that bad. Stand straight, eyes forward, yell "sir, yes sir" a lot, and eventually you'll pretty much get along just fine. My sergeant was a goof, however. He was an African-American man, the shortest man I'd ever met too, only standing just over 4.5 feet tall. He barely reached up to my chest. But he was a mean little guy. Until, however, he was alone with his men, in which case military conduct went right out the window. I only tell everyone this because it was this man who helped me foster a long-standing love for long-range rifles. He said I had a naturally calm hand, the eye of a falcon, and the necessary amount of don't give a crap to be one heck of a sharpshooter, which he and I simply ran with. Little did either of us know, the whole training facility was being watched by one creepy mofo in a slick black suit. When training was over, our months of basic fulfilled, I found waiting for me in the main facility the short man I called Sarge, along with a tall, thick, tan-skinned man in a black suit. You know the type of suit I'm talking about. The Secret Service wears them pretty often. The man said he was from an agency whose stance and operation he was not at liberty to divulge under normal circumstances. Forgive me for being impetuous, but who doesn't find the idea of having a spy or what looked to be a spy tell you that he thinks you're cut for that kind of work exciting? It wasn't until later I would learn this man was no spy, but my mind had been trained to the belief just like anyone else's. I found it odd, but the first thing he did when I agreed to the job, or at least to look further into it, was escort me to the main facility where he made a call on a small phone. I was so lost in the moment that I completely missed when he'd claimed I was being processed, or something along those lines. I would later find out that this meant my military record would be erased, and I would be subject to a more intense form of training that I'll not go into detail with. Rather, I'll give a slight explanation. This new training entailed levels of combat training that basic simply did not and never would cover. There were only 6 of us, but we were basically being treated like SEALs, at least until one little training session caught my attention, and I'll leave that part with just a name: torture methodology. Take that as you will, but this was the point where I started to question what I'd managed to get myself into. By the time I got out, I was told I wouldn't be allowed to engage in sports activities, competitive fighting of any kind, and several other activities I was no longer allowed to attend, even after what they referred to as retirement. This is all a basis to let you know just how bad I was in it. The actual story starts when I'm sent to a naval air station in a very dry and arid area. The name of the place I can't divulge. It was late summer 2007, hot as heck too. I'm a big guy, in the sense that all that training put me just over 270 pounds, which can be funky when you're only 5'8". Anyway, I was new on the base, and even though I had clearance for certain areas, It was odd that those areas seemed to be so far away from the main facility. This facility was like any other military NAS installation. There's a main office and 2 to 4 guards near the main entrance. Plenty of signs that say trespassers will be shot on sight, as well as some other warnings of bodily harm and death should someone bother to break into the base. I was a bit put off by the thought that this base required a certain level of clearance just to get through the main gate. From the gate, a vehicle can either turn left, right, or go straight. The left path travels towards the base's commissary, like a small shopping center with several stores put together like a small strip mall. The right path leads, however, along a much longer path, pushing out towards the galley, an auditorium of sorts, a movie theater, one half of the barracks, and the medical offices. The straight path, though, first loops around a memorial just inside the gate before heading out toward the other half of the barracks, before the road splits again. Mind you, this is a very rough description of the layout. There are also on-base living quarters, houses that line up a large corner of the base, a bar and diner too where people hang out, even batting cages and a small golf course set aside from everything. This was no small military base. However, if you keep on the main roads until they begin to warn you of advanced levels of clearance being needed, past these signs are nothing but blank roads for several miles until more hangars start to show up. These hangars are unmarked, whereas normal hangars are marked by a certain alphanumeric system in order to better help soldiers know where it is they need to go. Now, I need to point out, I've always suffered from insomnia, and it had only increased since joining this agency. I really didn't like that we worked so closely with the military, but seemed to keep away from them. And just as well, the people on the base always seemed to ignore you altogether. It just wasn't normal. In fact, it was a bit unsettling. However, when I get to my moments of inability to sleep, going for a long walk always seems to help. Unfortunately, this turned out to be the base where that was a bad idea. The land is pretty flat out in the direction of the hangars. I wanted to walk as far away from the noise as possible. This was definitely the place, as it just gets quieter and quieter the closer you get to the hangars. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced this yourself, but there's this odd feeling that comes with having someone watch you. When doing the kind of work I did, you tended to get used to this sort of feeling. In fact, you kind of rely on it. Even though I do my best to hide it, my hand flipped open the holster of my sidearm to make it easier and quicker to draw if I needed it. A 1911 chambered and .45 ACP. It's nothing to sneeze at, and really does make a body feel more secure, just reminding you that it's there. I came to an immediate stop with the pistol drawn. Sometimes I honestly scared myself with how quickly I could have had that pistol at the ready. But at the moment, I was shaking for a different reason. Roughly 25 yards ahead of me, standing just outside the halo of one of these street lamps that sporadically appear along the road at different intervals, was a figure, taller than any man, oddly blacked out, yet still clearly visible. Now remember, I'm a trained marksman. I can hit most targets with this particular sidearm at quite a distance. As I aimed my gun, the green light laser clearly on the thing's forehead, no matter what I did, I could not pull the trigger. Instead, I watch as its oddly shaped head tilts, only slightly, curiously to the right, before one of its oddly long arms reaches to the lamppost, almost as if pulling its body toward the thin metal post. I managed to catch a glimpse of pale, smooth gray skin and huge black eyes before it moved behind the post, never appearing from the other side. I've always been a man of math and physics throughout school, and nothing I've ever studied makes any sense of this. That pole was like any streetlight you've ever seen. A thin, maybe 1-foot diameter pole of treated wood, with a hooked lamp near the top casting a cone of light to the road below. This man, person, or thing just stepped out of the shadows and vanished behind something less than half as thin as it was. Shaking my head, I moved to get a better look. And no, there was nothing there. But then something from the corner of my eyes catches my attention. My mysterious stranger was now standing under the shade of another street lamp, roughly 1,000 yards away along the road. Several more times this happens. I can almost get close enough to make out a feature or two when the strange tall man thing steps behind the nearest post and simply disappears, reappearing again another 1,000 or so yards down the road at the next post. I can't explain the feeling I began to feel. I knew that I wasn't cleared for this area, but something was telling me to follow that thing. At the same time, I felt a real chill crawling over my skin, and I was trembling, something I only eventually noticed because of the rattling pistol in my hand. I started to notice that I was now very close to the strange hangers out in the sticks, when a pair of headlights from far off, past the hangers, approached me. The blinding lights gave me a moment to very casually put away my sidearm, with good timing, since the Jeep in question came to rest near me. "Is there a problem, Agent?" one of the two men asks, agent being the loose term for one of my people here. It's now that I realize that we agents didn't have any kind of real clearance, and these men didn't seem to care. One of them was a captain of fairly high rank. "No, sir. Military hammers that habit into you pretty hard. Trouble sleeping tonight. Going for walks helps. Thought I saw someone headed in this direction, so I followed them. I guess it was one of yours." The captain and the other soldier looked to one another for a moment. "It's getting pretty dark. Why don't you explain it to me while we give you a ride back to your room?" Living on the base isn't half bad, but the buildings feel like an expensive condo, and it's a bit of a drive considering the low speed limit posted on base. And trust me, a military base is no place to break the law. Sitting in the back seat, I now began to notice something about the captain's driver. He wasn't really moving, not in a traditional sense. The vehicle's motions didn't seem to affect him. He never turned to look in any direction other than forward. He didn't even move his arms, spare those rare moments when he had to make a turn. He almost felt like he was on autopilot. "Oh, don't mind him, he's just a driver," the captain pointed out. "Tell me about this fellow you were following." The captain was oddly jovial until the moment I began to describe the thing I'd witnessed. And oddly enough, his demeanor began to change. He was now constantly scratching his chin, before finally sighing and lighting a cigarette, offering the pack to me. But I refused as I didn't smoke. "The tall man. We've seen him around the base, all over the town too. It's odd. I saw him first a few years back when I was in Needles, California. Ever been there?" I shook my head, even though I had. Supposed UFO sighting capital of the United States. I was staying in a little motel out there, a rat trap sort of dive, back when I was a much lower rung on the ladder. It was just like any other day. I had no real clue why I was being placed in such a place. They said it was a security detail. I was set to watch over a small stretch of land outside the A51 along a perimeter fence. Local yahoos had always been trying to find out what exactly we're hiding on Area 51. He laughed. It's a funny thing. They'd never find anything there, even if they did get into the base. It really is just all experimental flight equipment. All the crazy crap is further inland, toward DC. But being agency, you already know that. I nodded. Some places even the CIA and FBI don't have clearance for, I replied. In fact, some places don't even give clearance. You're either on the project floor or you're not involved. So, sir, how did your run-in with this tall man work out? The captain chuckled, blowing out a huge cloud of smoke that wafted back into me. Scared the crap right out of me when I saw him, he pointed out. My post was practically in the middle of the desert. and I'm up on this high-up post for the night, sort of camoed into the side of the rock face to keep me from being spotted. The night was going on just like usual, so freaking boring I'm beating my own rear at cards. Full moon meant I didn't have much use for my lights. But suddenly, this tall, and I do mean tall, like 7 feet at least, figure steps out from behind this cactus out in the field. Thing is, he's on the other side of the fences. He steps behind a Joshua tree, Yucca brevifolia. If you've ever seen one, you know how ridiculous that is. They're thin as heck at the stem, way thinner than this guy. But I don't know, it's like he just flattened himself out behind it and vanished. I called it in. It was confirmed that they had unregistered motion in the area. But about 20 minutes later, there's a jeep, 3 armed men, and no matter where they search all that night, they just can't find the guy. The next morning, I'm dragged into an office by several guys from the agency. I'm forced to make a full report of what I saw and what happened. They swear me to secrecy, force me to sign an NDA, which is the norm for these sorts of things. There was no real issue. Even if I did say something, there was no chance anyone was going to believe me. After his story, the captain became pretty jovial again, joking around, talking about even joining me for lunch at the local grill the next day, which sounded like a fun deal to me. I still call this man my friend to this day. But after about 3 days, I was given more reports than an NSA agent, and oddly sent on my way. I refused to take any more walks after that, even a week after the incident. That was until one night, I found myself asleep in my bedroom. There's a small room at the back of what I'm going to call my apartment. I would be leaving the base within several more days before I headed back to DC to be reassigned to a different detail. Yet even with the creepy stranger in the middle of the night, this moment was what actually frightened me. I was suddenly awakened with this horrifying feeling of foreboding. Like something just wasn't right. And the feeling was actually so intense and wrong that I immediately reached for that very same 1911 that I keep just under the mattress of my bed. I then see them. One is uncommonly tall, about 6'5" or 6'6". The other was of average height at least, but seemingly much shorter compared to the other. They were both thick-bodied, as if they had both seen quite a few days in a gym. They were dressed in perfect black suits, each wearing black fedoras, and despite there being no light, they wore black shades. The men themselves were so pale, if I had seen them under normal circumstances, I would have guessed they were sick. Their skin was so white that against the darkness of my room it was impossible to miss them, and on a more subtle inspection, there wasn't a hair on their bodies. Even what I could see of their wrists from their suits, where you would normally see some level of hair from a normal man, there was nothing but more bare, pale skin. They didn't even seem to have eyebrows, which is odd to say the least. I remember lying there for hours, just wishing that if they were sent by the government to off me because I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to, that they would just do it. But they didn't even move. Not until I could see the color of early morning entering my room. The two simply turned around in the most robotic-looking motions I'd ever seen a man make, and filed out of my room. Stranger yet, there was no sound from the front room. No doorknob, no door opening or closing. Just a pair of insanely quiet footsteps that very slowly vanished from my life. Like most people interested in the paranormal, I've heard stories about how intimidating these men in black can be, but I'll never forget the moment I came face to face with them. For years after that day, I'd see these two men. I don't know how I was able to tell that it was them, considering their very generic appearances, but I knew it was. They would appear here and there, sometimes when I was out walking at night, sometimes at a market, a library, or even at work on a base, and at night, when they would simply stand at my bedroom doorway. After a while, though, their appearances became more and more infrequent, and they stopped altogether when I finally stopped working for that agency. Several times I had taken photos of the men, even videos, and I would find the next morning that said footage was gone from my phone. Since those days, I've only seen the men in black once, and the tall man not at all, since that night on the base. I still wonder what the deal was with the tall man. Was it an alien? Something else? If it was an alien, why was it trying to have me follow it to the hangars at the back of the base? As for the men in black, I know what they were there for. To make sure I kept my mouth shut. I don't want to think about what they would have done if they'd gotten word to take me out. I've recently moved to the state of Texas. I'm either surrounded by people, guns, or both. I now have a normal job, working semi-normal hours. The last time I saw the two men from my room on the base, they somehow appeared next to my vehicle at the grocery store. The short one produced a small all-black business card, turned, entered the vehicle beside me, a black Lincoln I think, I'm not a car guy, and simply left. The card is not important to all this. In fact, these cards won't even show their purpose unless viewed under a black light, so I'll leave that part out. Whatever the case, I have good reason that my insomnia is much worse. I fear that even though my action of burning the card when I got home was a clear rejection of the offer, I might wake up one day in an unfamiliar room. I don't know where life will take me after this run-in, but I do know that the MIB are real. They're out there, and I wish they were as lighthearted and free-spirited as those guys from the movies. Instead, they're frightening, persistent, unnatural, and I have a feeling that the next time I see them might be the very last time anyone sees me. The Thing in the Joshua Trees. From Mika Stargazer. This weird thing happened to me when I was a kid, around 11 or 12 years old. It was during this family trip to Joshua Tree National Park. My dad had just married my stepmom, we'll call her Vanessa, and we were doing this whole blended family bonding thing. It was me, my new stepsister Zoe, she was about 16 and thought she was too cool for everything, and my best friend, Katie, who my dad let come along because he felt bad about the whole remarriage thing. We were staying at this little rental house just outside the park. It was okay, I guess. Had this big window in the living room that looked out over all these weird Joshua trees. Back then, I remember them creeping me out. After dark, those trees looked like these big, spooky figures all hunched over. One night, me and Katie were sitting on the porch, trying to see if we could spot any UFOs. Yeah, we were those kind of kids. Zoe was inside, probably texting her boyfriend or whatever. Katie was going on about this documentary she'd watched. I'm telling you, Mika, the government knows about aliens. They're keeping it a secret because they think we can't handle the truth. I remember rolling my eyes. Yeah, sure. And Bigfoot is real too, right? That's when there was a weird noise. It was like a high-pitched yipping sound mixed with a deep gurgling. Very weird, I know. It didn't sound like a normal animal. I saw Katie's eyes get all huge. She then asked, "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, Zoe stuck her head out the door. "What are you dweebs doing out here?" "Shh," Katie hissed. "Listen." We all went quiet. After a few seconds, the yipping sound came again. It was louder now, and I could tell it was coming from the Joshua trees. Zoe's face went white. What the heck was that? I expected her to tell us we were being stupid, to come back inside, but instead, she walked out onto the porch with us. We stood there for a while, staring out into the darkness. The moon was high and bright that night, so we could see the shapes of the Joshua trees with ease. all twisted and weird. Katie suddenly grabbed my arm, nearly making me jump. "Look over there." At first, I didn't see anything, but then there was movement near one of the Joshua trees. Something was skulking about between the branches, low to the ground. It looked about the size of a very large dog, but its movements were very odd. They were jerky and unnatural. "I don't like this," Zoe said. And for once, she didn't sound all snarky and superior. She sounded scared. I was about to say we should all go back inside when that thing emerged from behind a Joshua tree. It was the freakiest thing I'd ever seen in my life. Its body was reptilian, with occasional patches of coarse, spiky fur. Its head was weirdly elongated, with a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth. Then its eyes, they were huge and red and glowed in the moonlight. Katie began to freak out. Oh my God, what is that?" Zoe hissed, "Hush, maybe it hasn't seen us yet." But right then, as if on cue, the thing turned its head and looked right at us. Those glowing red eyes seemed to stare right through me. The three of us froze there. I couldn't move. I didn't even want to breathe. It felt like time stood still, as we just stared at the thing and it stared at us. Then it made that noise again, the yip gurgle. But this time it started moving towards us. It moved in a weird loping gait, like its legs were way too long for its body. I heard Katie whimper beside me. Even Zoe gasped. Just as it made it to the edge of the porch, a car drove by on the road, headlights sweeping across the yard. The thing turned and hissed, a sound like steam escaping a radiator. And in a blink, it was gone, disappearing back into the Joshua trees with incredible speed. We all stood there for a moment, not saying a word. Then all at once, Zoe grabbed both of us by the arm and dragged us inside. She locked the door and closed all the curtains. "Okay." She was trying to sound calm, but her voice was shaking. "What the heck just happened?" Katie was trying not to hyperventilate. "An alien? A chupacabra or something?" I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to agree with Katie, but the entire rest of me was like, really? None of that is real, right? But I ended up saying, maybe it was just a weird shadow. The moment I said it, I didn't believe it. Zoe shook her head. "Mika, shadows don't make noise." We stayed up all night, just sitting in the living room with all the lights on. We tried to talk about other things, normal stuff, but we kept coming back to what we'd seen. In the morning, when it was plenty bright out, we went outside to look around. We didn't find a thing. Footprints, slime, nothing like that, like you would see in the movies. Just typical desert. We didn't tell our parents. I mean, what were we gonna say? "Hey Dad and new stepmom, we just saw a freaking sweet chupacabra outside, wanna take a look?" Yeah, I don't think so. They'd probably say it was a weird cactus we saw or something like that. I'm older now, still not sure what that thing even was. If you're reading or listening to this, what do you think it was? A chupacabra or alien like Katie said? Or just a very weird shared delusion? If you ever find yourself at Joshua Tree National Park, well, best of luck to you. Desert Night Terror from Ryan AZ 1986. I was on a camping trip with some buddies in southern Arizona, near the Mexican border. We'd gone out there to do some off-roading and target shooting. Just guy stuff, you know? There were 4 of us. Me, my brother Nathan, and our friends Antonio and Elijah. We'd been out there for a couple of days already, just messing around and having a good time. One day, we'd spent most of the afternoon riding our ATVs, through these dry washes and over the hills. By evening, we were pretty worn out, so we headed back to our campsite to grill some steaks and have a few beers. Our camp was in this little valley between some low hills. There wasn't much around there besides scrubby desert plants and some scattered boulders. You could see for miles in every direction, just empty desert as far as the eye could see. Anyway, we were sitting around the fire after dinner, swapping stories and telling jokes. It was a clear night, and you could see like a million stars. No moon though, so it was still kind of dark away from the fire. I got up to take a leak and walked a little ways from camp. I was just finishing up my business when I heard this weird sound off in the distance. It's hard to describe. It was like a low grumble, a very deep noise. I looked in the direction it came from, but I couldn't see anything through the dark. I figured it was probably just the wind, blowing just the right way over the hills and through the sand to create a very low rumble. So I headed on back to the camp. As I walked, I got this prickly feeling on the back of my neck. I didn't say anything to the other guys at first. I didn't want them to think I was being a wuss. But a little while later, Elijah suddenly sat up straight and was like, "Do you guys hear that?" We all went quiet, and sure enough, there was that weird sound again. It seemed closer than before. Antonio made some joke about it being a chupacabra, but you could tell he was a little freaked out too. Nathan got up, sweeping it back and forth. For a second, I thought I saw something move, just at the edge of the light. But it was gone so fast, I figured I'd imagined it. We were all a little on edge after that. We talked about packing up and leaving, but it was late, and we'd all been drinking anyway. We decided to just keep the fire going and stick close to camp. Nothing else happened for a while. We were starting to relax again. But then, around midnight, the sound came back, that low frequency. This time it was much closer, maybe only a couple 100 yards away. The more I listened this time, the more it sounded like a multitude of noises. Like whatever was making it, there was a group of them. We all jumped up then, grabbing flashlights and looking around wildly. That's when things got really weird. The air around us suddenly felt heavy, like the atmosphere had rapidly changed. Then we began to see shapes moving in the dark. They were hard to focus on, but I could tell they were big, the size of a person at least, and there were several of them, circling the camp, just out of reach of the light. I had never been so scared before. We were all yelling and shouting and panicking, not sure what to do. We tried to scare the things away, but I don't think it was working. Antonio even fired a few shots in the air with his pistol. The shapes seemed to back off for a moment, but they began to close in again. And then we saw something else. The sky overhead grew black, like a wave of blackness took over the stars in the sky. I realize now what I was seeing then looked like some sort of giant craft, so big as to blot out the sky. We all began to make a run for it. We scrambled for our keys and booked it for the trucks. I don't think I've ever moved so fast. As we ran, I felt something brush against my back, like something just barely missed grabbing me. We piled into our trucks and tore out of there, leaving behind loads of camping gear that we would never go back for. We drove for hours, not slowing down until we saw Tucson. None of us really talked much on the way. We had nothing and yet everything to say. We finally stopped at this gas station. Then we began to vent. Elijah was convinced it was aliens. Nathan thought it was some kind of weird military experiment. They do have a lot of bases out there in the desert. Antonio joked again about chupacabras, but I could tell his heart wasn't in it. As for me, I've got no idea what to think. We reported it to the sheriff's department the next day, but they pretty much blew us off. Said we probably just spooked ourselves. seeing some coyotes or something. But I know that wasn't a coyote. There's no mistaking what I saw around our camp and blotting out the sky above us. Over time, whenever I had the chance, I would ask people if they had any similar experiences. I've gotten a few stories, usually from friends or acquaintances who are hikers or campers in remote areas. Oddly enough, several different people had similar stories about a rumbling sound. I'm hesitant to share the story these days. There's a lot of folks who hear that you've been drinking in your story and immediately think you were hallucinating. Because a couple of beers definitely does that to you, huh? Sarcasm. There was this one guy I met at a bar who said he saw something very similar when he was working on an oil rig out in West Texas. He said these huge shapes surrounded their site one night, making weird noises that messed with their equipment. By morning, everything was back to normal, but half the crew ended up quitting on the spot. On a different occasion, I was talking to an older Native American guy who had overheard me telling my story. He didn't seem surprised at all. He said there were old stories about spirits in the desert, which can take physical form, spirits that are drawn to fear and negative emotions. Not really sure what to make of all that. I'm not a spiritual person, and I like to think there's a logical explanation for everything. But after what I saw that night, it's hard not to admit there's a lot of weird stuff out there that we don't understand. I thought I killed someone. From Diesel Dog 78. I've been driving trucks for nearly 20 years now, mostly long hauls across the Southwest. Let me be upfront with you about this. You see a lot of weird stuff on the road, especially after dark. But this one time still gives me the creeps. It was about 5 years ago. I was hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to El Paso. It was a hot August night, and I was on this lonely stretch of highway cutting through the Sonoran Desert. I think it was around 2 a.m. The road was empty, just me and miles of darkness. I had the radio on low, some old country station fading in and out. The AC was blasting, fighting against the heat seeping in from outside. I do recall sucking on a cherry Tootsie Pop, trying to keep myself alert. That's when my headlights caught something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a broken down car. As I got closer, I realized it was a person. Now, normally, I don't stop for hitchhikers. Too risky these days. But something made me slow down. It was a woman. She looked to be in her 50s. She was wearing this flowery dress that seemed way too nice for being stranded in the desert. When I pulled over, she didn't move towards the truck. Instead, she just stood there, staring at me. I rolled down the passenger window. "Howdy, ma'am. You okay? You need any help?" She didn't answer right away, just kept staring with these real wide eyes. Eventually, she did reply,
"It's coming. We have to go."
Her voice was all raspy, like she'd been breathing in sand. Now I'm thinking maybe she's had a few too many or something. But I couldn't just leave her out here. So I asked, "Where are you headed to? I can give you a lift to the next town." She nodded and climbed in. She didn't say thanks or anything, just sat there real stiff-like. I noticed she wasn't sweating, even though it must have been over 100 degrees out. We drove in silence for a while. I tried to make some small talk, but she just stared straight ahead. After about 20 minutes, I began to get this weird feeling. The air in the cab felt heavy, and there was a smell to it like ozone, like right before a big thunderstorm. I glanced over at her then. I swear I saw her eyes glowing, and I don't mean like reflecting my dashboard lights. They were actually glowing, a pale blue color. Before I could say anything, she turned to me and said,
"Stop the truck."
Her voice was different now, deeper with a weird echo to it. I was so freaked out, I just did what she said. I pulled over to the shoulder and put it in park. As soon as we stopped, she got out. I watched her in my side mirror as she walked around to the back of the trailer. That's when things got really weird. The air started to shift, like heat waves, but more intense. Then, right there in my mirror, I saw the back of my trailer open up. Not like the doors opening, but more like the sides were peeling apart. I couldn't move, couldn't blink. I sat there watching as this woman walked into the glowing tear in my trailer, no, in reality itself, and just disappeared. But before she did, I remember her turning and looking right at me, and I swear her face wasn't human anymore. It was a mess of angles and shapes that made no sense. And like that, she was gone. The moment that weird tear closed up, everything instantly went back to normal, like it never happened. I have no idea how long I sat there. Could have been minutes, maybe hours. When I finally came to, my shirt was soaked with sweat and I was shaking like a leaf. I got out to check the back of the trailer. Everything looked normal. The seal was intact, no sign of any disturbance. But that smell was still there, like electricity and ozone. I thought about calling the cops, but what was there to report? Sounded like a scene straight from the X-Files. So I just crawled back in the cab and kept driving, pretending that I didn't see anything. When I got to the depot, I half expected my cargo to be missing or changed in some way. But everything was exactly as it should be. I even checked the security seal again, but it was untouched. I took a few days off after that run. Couldn't bring myself to get back in the truck right away. When I finally did, I avoided that stretch of highway for months. After a long time and quite a bit of denial, I hope and assume that what happened was a sort of dream. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and saw the most weird crap possible. But even that explanation doesn't really make perfect sense. Not to mention, I can remember that smell so vividly. Now, truckers do talk quite a bit to each other. We share our weird experiences on the road. But let me tell you something. I still have never heard a story like this. Let's just say I have even less of a reason to pick up hitchhikers these days. The Mirage, from Harold S. I don't bring this story up much. It happened to me back in '66, and it still haunts me. I was just a kid then, barely 12 years old. My dad had taken a local job at some mining operation, just south of the border. Mom wasn't too happy about having to move to Mexico, but times were tough and work was work. We lived in a tiny company town, if you could even call it that. It was just a cluster of prefab houses, a general store, and more dust than you could shake a stick at. There were only a handful of other kids around, most of them younger than me. I spent a lot of time exploring the desert, much to my mother's dismay. "Harold," she'd say, "you be careful out there. The desert's not forgiving to fools." But at that age, I thought I was invincible. I'd wander around for hours, collecting my favorite rocks, imagining I was some great explorer. It was late June when it happened. School was out, and the heat that year was oppressive. I remember sneaking out early one morning, before the sun could really turn up the thermostat. I had this idea I was going to hike to the top of a mesa I'd spotted in the distance. I packed up a cantina, some sandwiches, and set off. The walk was longer than I'd anticipated. By midday, I was tired, hot, and starting to worry I'd gotten myself lost. It was then that I saw it, a glimmer on the horizon. At first, I thought it was just a mirage, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. There in the middle of nowhere was a pool of water. Not some muddy puddle or a stagnant pond, but crystal clear, pure water, almost glowing in the harsh sunlight. Standing next to it was this man. Now, when I say man, I'm not sure that's the right word. He was tall, impossibly tall, with skin that seemed to shift colors like oil on water. He wore some kind of robe that moved, even though there wasn't a breath of wind. I froze, not sure whether to run or call out. Before I could decide, he turned and looked right at me. His eyes I will never forget. They were like looking into the night sky, full of stars and swirling galaxies.
Ossersate, niño,
he said. His voice was like distant thunder. I found myself walking towards him, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. When I reached the pool, he gestured for me to look into the water. What I saw, it wasn't my reflection. It was like looking through a window into another world. This is gonna sound crazy, but I saw cities made of crystal, strange creatures moving through purple skies, things I don't even have words for. The images shifted and changed, showing me things that my mind could barely comprehend. Not sure how long I sat there, staring into this impossible pool. Finally, the man, or whatever he really was, placed a hand on my shoulder. His touch was electric, sending tingles down my spine.
Recuerda,
he said. Remember. And then, just like that, he was gone. The pool was gone too, leaving nothing but dry, cracked earth. I was alone in that desert, the sun starting to dip towards the horizon. I made it back home just after dark, my parents frantic, ready to send out a search party. I tried to tell them what had happened, but the words wouldn't come out. In the end, I admitted I'd gotten lost, and I told them that I fell asleep on a rock. I was grounded for a month, but it didn't matter. I could not stop thinking about what I'd seen. We moved back to the States the following year. Dad's job didn't pan out, and Mom got homesick. As I grew older, I started to wonder if what I'd experienced was just some kind of heat-induced hallucination. But even if it was, boy was it a crazy one. Deep down, though, I believe it was real. Now you could probably tell from the year I mentioned earlier, but I'm an old man. In all my years since, I've never seen anything like it. Sometimes when I drift off to sleep, I catch glimpses of those crystal cities and alien skies, and I can remember his voice so clearly.
Recuerda.
I've never been able to figure out what it all meant. Did I really get a glimpse into another dimension? A message from some alternate reality? Or was it simply the overactive, heat-induced imagination of a lonely kid in the desert? I'll never know. The Thing in the Mesquite. From Lyle W. I've kept this story mostly to myself for over 30 years. It's not really something to bring up at family gatherings or over beers with friends. But lately, I've been thinking maybe it's time to share it. Maybe someone out there has seen something like it. It all happened between 1988 and 1990 on our family ranch in West Texas, right on the edge of the Chihuahuan Desert. We had about 100 acres, mostly scrubland with some areas of mesquite thickets. It wasn't much, but it was home. I was 26 when it started, fresh off a divorce and back home to help my folks run the place. My cousin, Ferdinand, lived with us too. His parents died when he was a baby, so my folks had raised him like their own. He was more of a brother to me than a cousin. We called him Ferd for short, and on his grumpier days we'd joke, saying we were furred up with him. The first incident was in the summer of '88. Ferdinand and I were out checking on the cattle in the south pasture. It was hotter than heck, probably pushing 105 degrees. We were both complaining about the heat when we heard it. A high-pitched whine, like a dog whistle. I'm surprised we could hear it at all. "What do you think that is?" Ferdinand asked, looking around. We tried to pinpoint where it was coming from, and then we saw something. A figure darting between the mesquite trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I focused, I realized I was seeing something very real. It was human-shaped, but wrong in every way. It stood about 7 feet tall, body pale and hairless, almost translucent in the harsh sunlight. Its limbs were too long, too thin, like they'd been stretched out. The head was oversized and bulbous, with huge black almond-shaped eyes that seemed to swallow up the light. For a split second, it stopped and looked right at us. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the heat. Then, in a blink, the thing was gone, leaving us to wonder if we'd really seen anything at all. Over the next few weeks, even though the two of us didn't talk much about it, I noticed Ferdinand watching the mesquite thickets with a very wary eye. He began to carry his rifle everywhere he went when working, something he never did before. The second incident was in the spring of '89. A buddy of mine named Mitch was over, helping us repair some fencing. Mitch was an ex-rodeo rider, tough as nails and not one for flights of fancy. He'd been there for me during the divorce, even offered me a job in town. But I just couldn't leave the ranch. It was in my blood. We were working near an arroyo when Mitch suddenly stopped, cocking his head to the side. "What is that smell?" At first, I didn't smell it, but then it got to me, this weird metallic scent, sort of like copper. "Maybe something dead, maybe a storm blowing in," Ferdinand said. But the sky was clear as could be, not a cloud in sight, no dead animals that I could see either. I then saw a dust devil forming. Now, dust devils aren't uncommon out here, but this one was different. It appeared to be moving against the wind, and it almost seemed to have a purpose, because it came right at us, growing bigger as it approached. The air around it seemed to bend and warp, like reality itself was being twisted. We all hit the dirt, covering our faces. The wind howled around us, and for a moment, I swear I heard voices in that wind, a language I'd never heard before, but maybe it was nothing. When it passed by, we looked up. A practically perfect circle had been scorched into the earth where the dust devil had been. The earth was glassy, like it had been subjected to extreme heat, and in the center of that circle, there was a strange shape or symbol in it. A spiral with odd angular lines jutting out from it. Mitch stared at it, his face pale. "What in the world is that?" None of us had an answer. We finished the fence in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. That night, Mitch decided to leave earlier than usual. He didn't come around much after that. Things would escalate in the winter of '89. We began to lose livestock. At first, it was just a chicken here and there, then a goat. We figured it was coyotes, but then we lost a cow. We found her one morning, what was left of her. She'd been drained completely of blood, her hide left intact, but everything inside was just gone. It was like someone had hollowed her out with surgical precision. My dad was beside himself. The ranch was already struggling, and we couldn't afford to lose any more animals. We started to take turns keeping watch at night. Ferdinand rigged up some floodlights around the main pasture, and we'd sit out there with our rifles, watching. It was on one of these nights in January of '90 that I had my most terrifying encounter. It was cold for Texas, probably in the low 40s. I was in my old truck at the edge of the main pasture, thermos of coffee keeping me company. The radio was on low, some late-night talk show about UFOs and government conspiracies. Normally, I'd change the station, but that night it seemed oddly fitting. Around midnight, I saw movement at the edge of the Mesquite thicket. I flicked on the floodlights we'd rigged up, and there it was, caught in the harsh glare. It was the same creature we'd seen that summer, but seeing it up close was a whole different story. Its skin was a sickly white, almost translucent. I could see dark shapes moving beneath it, like its organs were shifting around at all times. Those huge black eyes were now fixed on me, unblinking. Or could they even blink? I had no idea. But the worst part was its mouth. It was lipless, just a slash across its face. And as I watched, it opened far wider than a human mouth ever could, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. I fumbled for my rifle, but before I could raise it, the thing was at the truck. It moved so fast, it was simply a blur. Its hand, if you could call it that, slammed against the window. The glass spiderwebbed instantly, spreading out from the center of its hand. I cranked the engine and floored it, tearing away from that thing as quickly as I could. In the rear view, I saw it standing there watching me go. It didn't chase me. I was surprised by that. I watched it turn around instead, loping back into the mesquite, moving with that unnatural fluid grace. I floored it back to the house. Ferdinand found me there, white as a sheet and babbling about what I'd seen. He believed me. He'd seen enough by then to know I was not making this up. That would be the last time I would see it up close, but it's not the end of the story. The livestock deaths stopped after that night, but other things continued to happen. We'd find strange footprints around the ranch. Huge three-toed prints that didn't match any animal we knew. Sometimes at night we'd hear a high-pitched, keening sound echoing across the land, setting all the dogs to howling. We found more of those symbols too, burned into the ground or carved into rocks. Each one was different, all giving off the same feeling of wrongness. Ferdinand looked into them, even reached out to professors and archaeologists. Most ignored him. The few who didn't said the symbols didn't match any known culture or language. My parents decided to sell the ranch in late '90. Said they were too old for the work, but I knew the real reason. The place simply didn't feel like home anymore. It felt watched, like every mesquite tree might be hiding one of those things, like any shadow around might come alive. We didn't get many offers for the place. Seems like word had gotten around about the weird goings-on there. In the end, we had to sell it for a fraction of what it was worth to a developer who wanted to turn it into some kind of New Age retreat. Last I heard, he had abandoned those plans. I believe that land stands empty now. Ferdinand and Mitch don't like talking about what happened. Last time I brought it up, at Ferd's daughter's birthday a few years afterwards, they both got real quiet. Mitch muttered something about some things are better left alone, and Ferd just shook his head and walked away. I've tried to make sense of it all over the years, looked into local legends, paranormal research, even some far-out scientific theories. Nothing quite fits. The closest I've come is some old Native American stories about skinwalkers. But I don't think that's the best explanation. These days I live in San Antone. I tell myself it's for work, but I know it's because I sleep better with streetlights outside my window and the sounds of traffic drowning out the night. I highly doubt I'd be able to sleep well if I still lived on some ranch. Thank you for tuning in to Unexplained Encounters. If you're not already, follow and listen to Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Leave us a rating while you're at it. Get some cool creepy merch at eeriecast.store. Check out my other show where I narrate scary work stories. It's called Tales from the Break Room. For more terrifyingly entertaining shows from EerieCast, go to eeriecast.com. And if you want to listen to Unexplained Encounters and all the other EerieCast shows without pesky ads, sign up for EerieCast Plus at eeriecast.com/plus. You'll also get exclusive access to horror audiobooks only available to EerieCast Plus members. And you'll get 20% off our EerieCast.store merch through our members-only monthly discount code. Finally, if you have a scary story of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org. I think that's about it. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.